The Shadows of the Empire, sometimes known as the movie without a movie or the franchise without a film. Originally conceived somewhere around 1994 and released in 1996, it featured just about every piece of media it was possible to have in the 90s, except a film. It got a novel, it got a comic book series, it got trading cards, it got a toy line, it got a video game, it even got a soundtrack for the movie that was never made. Shadows occupies a unique place in the history of the Star Wars franchise. It was the first multimedia project that Lucasfilm engaged in since the original trilogy, with the massive franchise that it ended up spawning, and the story that forms the core of this multimedia event was the first time in which the criminal underworld of Star Wars was properly explored. As the promotional video for Shadows of the Empire made abundantly clear, this wasn't just good versus evil anymore. Now, there was a third party.
After the Empire Strikes Back and before Return of the Jedi, there was a time when heroes and villains alike lived in the shadows of the Empire.
Though it turned out to be basically another flavor of bad. But since Should This Be Canon is story-oriented, I'm only going to be focusing on two, technically three, aspects of this multimedia franchise. First, the book and comic, as they are essentially two slightly different versions of the same story, and then the video game, which is connected but does tell its own story. So, first, as usual, origin story time. In addition to Wikipedia, which is generally a fairly reliable go-to source for production details, there are also several videos on the subject, and I want to give them credit for this, so I'm going to link their videos in the description. Also, thanks to Internet Archive, I was able to read the tell-all book behind this multimedia event, Secrets of the Shadows of the Empire, by Mark Cotta Vaz, linked to that in the description as well. There is a lot of detail involved in the origin story of Shadows of the Empire, but the short version is this. Somewhere between 1993 and 1994, a dinner conversation was had between Lou Aronica, then publisher for Bantam Spectra, the sci-fi imprint of Bantam Books, the company that has published all Star Wars novels, and Lucy Autry Wilson, who had begun as assistant to director George Lucas in the creation of A New Hope. Her other noteworthy contribution to that film was that at one point, Ben Burtt, who was sound designer for both the original and the prequel trilogies, recorded a conversation between Wilson and another assistant, Bunny Alsop, after they'd inhaled helium, and the edited version of that conversation was used to provide some of the alien babble in the Mos Eisley Cantina scene. By the 90s, Wilson had gone on to work for Lucas Books, the publishing imprint for Lucasfilm. According to the sources, it was Aronica who had the original idea of a storyline told across multiple forms of media, and thus the project that would eventually be Shadows of the Empire was born. George Lucas approved the idea, and after a few initial meetings, it was agreed that Shadows of the Empire would be released in 1996, as there were no major releases being planned for that year. Lucas had intended to release the OT special editions that year, but he bumped it back to 97, which in turn is why The Phantom Menace was released in 1999 rather than 1997 as he'd originally planned. At first, the idea of Shadows was that it was going to be between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, but it was John Knowles, one of the game developers at LucasArts, who persuaded them that the better idea would be to set it between Empire and Return of the Jedi. Wilson and Howard Rothman, who joined Lucasfilm 2 weeks before the release of Empire and has ever since functioned as one of the managers of the Star Wars franchise, dreamed up the basic premise of an assassination plot against Luke Skywalker, and it was off to the races. From there, we diverge to how the book and its comic adaptation came to be. Enter author Steve Perry. Born in Louisiana, and after a very colorful early life in which he went through multiple careers include nurse, clerk, swimming instructor, martial arts instructor, toy maker, and private detective, Perry was, in his own words, bitten by the writing bug, and has been a sci-fi and fantasy writer ever since. His most notable original work is the Matador series, but he's likely more well known for his contributions to other IPs like Conan the Barbarian, Star Wars, and Alien. Funnily enough, the reason that he got the job of writing Shadows of the Empire was because he'd written the novelization for Jim Carrey's The Mask for free as a favor to Tom Dupree, then senior editor of Bantam Spectra. Getting tapped to write Shadows of the Empire was Dupree's way of repaying that favor. As to the comic adaptation, the story it tells is mostly the same as the novel, just with a few extra subplots thrown in. Finding the right people for that job fell to writer Wyndham, then author and editor at Dark Horse. For artist, he ultimately went with Irishman Killian Plunkett, who would go on to be chief character designer for The Clone Wars and art director for Rebels, respectively. As for who got to fill the writer's chair, that honor fell to John Wagner, who some might know as one of the founders of a sort of obscure little British comic called 2000 AD and is the principal creative mind behind a certain Judge Dredd. And so writers and artists alike set to work, with Wyndham and continuity editor Alan Kausch as go-betweens coordinating everything. Fun fact, to help with the project, Kausch created the very first visual timeline of the internal history of Star Wars. Apparently, that ended up being a 3-foot-long scroll. With all that out of the way, we begin Shadows of the Empire. And the first thing that you realize when you compare the book and the comic side by side is that while both stories do eventually converge on the same point and the same climax, they have very different starting points. So for the first part of this video, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between the early events of the book and the early events of the comic in as best a chronological order as I can manage. We begin in the midst of The Empire Strikes Back as Palpatine and Vader have their little chat about the threat of Luke Skywalker and whether or not he might be turned to the dark side. What Vader didn't know at the time was that there was a third party listening in on their conversation with Palpatine's consent. Prince Shizor, Phaleen nobleman, officially owner of Shizor Transport Systems, one of the largest and richest shipping conglomerates in the known galaxy, secretly the head of Black Sun, the galaxy's premier criminal organization. In fact, Shizor Transport Systems mostly serves as a front for Black Sun. And with the combined wealth of his legitimate and illegitimate enterprises, he is essentially the third wealthiest man in the galaxy. Palpatine and Vader being 1 and 2, respectively. The thing is, Vader and Shizor cordially hate one another, although the Phaleen is much better at concealing his animosity. At this point, Vader strongly suspects that Shizor is the head of Black Sun, and has over the years tried to find various ways of proving this to Palpatine, in the hopes that the smug crime lord would finally be put in his place. What Vader never learned, though, was that Palpatine was always aware of Shizor's connections. He just chose to pretend ignorance because it suited him. The Phaleen was, at the time, useful to him. However, what neither Sith Lord knew was that Shizor had very, very personal reasons for hating Vader and wanting to bring him down. There had been a high-security Imperial biolab in the capital city of the Phaleen homeworld, Phaleen. And one fine day, a particularly nasty, flesh-destroying virus got loose. Vader was in orbit above the planet at the time and made a snap decision. From his perspective, it was either bombard the city and its immediate surroundings with lasers to literally kill everything within with fire, or let the virus potentially infect the entire planet, or worse yet, escape off-world. So of course, Vader chose the cauterize option. The thing is, among the many, many dead in that ruined, charred city were Shizor's relatives. The head of Black Sun had used his extensive criminal assets to erase any evidence of his connection to those dead Phaleen, but ever since he had nursed a vendetta against Vader. And apart from one day supplanting Palpatine and ruling the galaxy in both the legal and illegal sense, his other dearest wish was to see his hated enemy destroyed. What's more, Shizor was one of the few beings in the galaxy who actually knew that Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker and Sith Lord Darth Vader were one and the same. So when he listened in on that conversation between Palpatine and Vader about Luke Skywalker and Vader's promise to turn the boy or kill him, Shizor had finally found a chink in Vader's armor. He would use his own son to destroy his hated rival. That's how the book introduces Shizor. The comic version begins almost immediately after Empire Strikes Back, with Luke still trying to get used to his new prosthetic hand and a surprise attack by a small Imperial fleet stumbling onto the rebels. Of course, being outnumbered, the imps try to escape, but Rogue Squadron takes care of them pretty easily. Cut to the Executor, with Vader having another conversation by a hologram with Palpatine, also with Shizor secretly listening in. Personally, I think Plunkett's art is kind of but I do love the expression on this Imperial right here. That is the appropriate expression to have when Vader walks by. We then skip ahead a little in time. We're not given an exact amount of months or weeks. All we know for certain is that Empire Strikes Back and Shadows of Empire both take place within the same year, 3 ABY. And the story, particularly the first few chapters of the book, focuses principally on establishing the principal characters here. Luke, Leia, Shizor, and to a lesser extent Darth Vader. Vader's is the briefest, but it's also interesting, so I'm going to dwell on that first. It turns out that over the years, Vader has figured out a way to kind of heal himself. He can't regenerate those 4 severed limbs of his, but when channeling his anger through the dark side, he's learned how to temporarily regenerate his internal organ tissues so that he can breathe and function without cybernetics. I say temporarily because every time Vader succeeds, he's so happy to finally breathe like a normal person that he immediately loses his grip on his anger and thus the dark side, and he has to go back to relying on his machines to keep him alive. Basically, in order to make this stick, Vader has to maintain a state of perpetual anger. If only he could go to the 40K universe and order himself some butcher's nails, that would solve the problem. In the meantime, though, the Dark Lord does recognize that Luke Skywalker, his son, is a potential weakness, an impediment to him fully embracing the dark side in all its totality, giving Vader even more motivation to either turn or destroy his son. As for Shizor, the principal antagonist, he's basically the ultimate playboy crime lord. He's an evil reptilian Bruce Wayne. Apparently, Shizor's appearance and character was hammered out over the course of several meetings at Skywalker Ranch, and he went through several initial designs before the final one was created by the unfortunately named Michael Butkus, who claims that he got the idea while listening to Danny Elfman's Batman theme. Yeah, that sounds about right. From the get-go, the novel establishes 3 things about Shizor. 1, he's insanely rich. At one point, he takes a gemstone worth several million credits from someone willing to make a deal with him and tosses it onto his desk, not caring if it falls to the floor and the cleaning droids hoover it up. 2, he's utterly ruthless, as when he sniffs out that one of his 9 lieutenants, or Vigos, has been cheating him out of his share of the profits and has him killed on the spot. Thirdly, he is deadly in personal combat, as he easily subdues and kills with his bare hands the son of a former business rival that he'd driven to suicide, who had been let into the palace by Vader in the hopes that he might actually kill the feline. Fun fact, Shizor is a practitioner of Teras Kasi, which many old-school Star Wars fans might remember from that one time LucasArts tried to make a fighting game. Steve Perry is in fact a practitioner of an Indonesian martial art called Silat, and that's basically what Teras Kasi is, Silat in the Star Wars universe, although apparently the name is Finnish. The meeting with the Vigos also introduces the character of Guri, who looks like a stunningly beautiful statuesque blonde, but is in fact a rare human replica droid. Think the TX from Terminator 3 minus the liquid metal part. She's programmed to be hyper-intelligent, is super strong thanks to a bionic endoskeleton, and is the perfect infiltration unit. To maintain her cover, she is actually capable of eating and defecating, things that droids generally don't do. Only way to really tell if she was organic or not would be to use a highly advanced scanning system or just cut her open. At any rate, while our villains are confident, our heroes have issues. By this point, Luke had gone back to Tatooine, specifically Ben Kenobi's old hut, where he was in the process of creating a new lightsaber for himself while struggling to deal with what he'd gone through. Doubly haunted by Vader's insistence that he is his father, at this point Luke still doesn't know if it's true or not, and his memory of his failure in the Darkside cave on Dagobah. By now, Luke has realized just how close he came to the dark side on Bespin. Meanwhile, Leia is still grieving the loss of Han. At one point, she literally has a nightmare reliving the moment where he was frozen in carbonite. But behind the grief, there is an icy determination to get him back. And at last, after all that setup, Lando Calrissian comes in with a lead. Boba Fett has not yet managed to deliver Han's slab to Jabba. Bounty hunting is a very competitive business, and he was waylaid briefly by IG-88, obviously hoping to take the bounty for itself. Fett did manage to outmaneuver the droid, but came away with a heavily damaged Slave 1. Too damaged to make it all the way to Tatooine. According to Lando's contact, one Dash Rendar, we'll get to him later, Fett has gone to an Imperial enclave on the moon of Gaul to get his ship repaired. All they have to do is link up with Dash, call up Rogue Squadron for backup, and they're on their way. On the subject of Boba Fett, he's a little too talkative in this story for my liking, but then again I've recently come off K.W. Jeter's pretty great Bounty Hunter Wars trilogy, which came out after Shadows of Empire, and it must be admitted that even before Lucasfilm was bought by Disney, Boba Fett's characterization wasn't always consistent. Still, I would have preferred it if all this dialogue had been in thought bubbles rather than speech bubbles. Unfortunately, the attempt to rescue Han Solo on Gaul was a failure. While Luke and Rogue Squadron kept the orbital defenses occupied, 12 X-Wings against at least 2 Star Destroyers and their full complements of TIEs, the Millennium Falcon and Dash Rendar's Outrider came in on a very, very low approach, literally scraping the tops of Gaul's forests so as to avoid detection by the Imperial Enclave. Hopefully, they would then have the element of surprise and be able to take back Han before either the Imperials or Boba Fett could stop them. Speaking of Fett, the Mandalorian had a run-in with some of his colleagues, including Bosk the Trandoshan and Zuckuss the Gand. Naturally, they wanted to cut in on the 10,000 credit reward for Han Solo. And just as naturally, Fett refused and had to shoot his way out. Naturally, the bounty hunters had sent a second party aboard Slave 1 to try and take the carbonite slab while Fett was occupied, but Fett being Fett, he dealt with them too. Including the disabling of Forlom, the other famous droid bounty hunter of Star Wars. Unfortunately for Lando, Leia, and company, Dash Rendar, it seems, is pretty legalistic when it comes to his contracts. He'd been hired to guide them to the Imperial Enclave, not help them rescue Han. Not explicitly anyway, and so he backed out once he'd led them there. And even as amazing as the Millennium Falcon is, by itself it couldn't handle the now fully alert Imperial Enclave. The Falcon took serious damage, especially to its comms, and so not only did Slave 1 escape, but Lando and Leia were unable to warn Luke of what was coming so that he and Rogue Squadron could try and intercept Fett. As if the day couldn't get any worse, one of Rogue Squadron was lost in the Imperial attack, and then another Rogue had his X-Wing hijacked by his own R2 unit, who then tried to shoot Luke. With luck and the help of the Force, Luke was able to disable the Rogue X-Wing and they were able to tow it back to their little secret base. It soon transpired that the Rogue R2 unit had been tampered with by a supposedly loyal rebel tech, who actually tried to pull a gun on Luke. Good news, Wedge got her first. Bad news, it meant she wouldn't be talking anytime soon. Even after backtracking through his own somewhat limited underworld channels, Lando could only determine that this rebel tech had been paid by the Empire. Which didn't make any sense to Luke, since Vader had quite explicitly wanted to keep him alive so he could turn him to the dark side. And it was then that Leia had an idea. At this point, pursuing Fett was pointless. Someone should instead go to Tatooine and await the delivery of Han to Jabba the Hutt. And she tapped Luke for that job. Partly because now that someone in the Empire wanted him dead, he'd be safest on a planet he knew so well. It is, after all, pretty easy to hide on Tatooine. While Luke would be in hiding and keeping an eye out for Slave 1, Leia determined to get to the bottom of who was behind these attempts to kill him. And to her mind, there was only one organization in the galaxy with the information resources to help find out the truth. Black Sun. And, after a little effort, she managed to persuade a reluctant Lando to help put her in contact with someone from that organization. Meanwhile, Vader was setting his own plans in motion. Knowing that his son would likely try to rescue his friend Solo, Vader had one of his agents, a man named Jix, go to Tatooine and somehow enter the service of Jabba the Hutt. This way he could keep an eye out for Luke if and when he tried to rescue his friend. Luckily for Jix, he was able to achieve this easily by joining the swoop gang of one Big Giz, one of Jabba's many thuggish henchmen. What's amusing is that Jix achieved his membership by challenging Big Giz to a swoop race and then cheating to win. Luckily for him, it seemed Big Giz appreciates a good dirty trick. Shortly after joining the swoop gang, Jix and the others were called in for a meeting with Jabba the Hutt, who informed them of a hefty Imperial bounty for Luke Skywalker dead rather than alive. Jix was confused, unsurprisingly given that he is one of Vader's agents, and Vader has made it clear on multiple occasions that he wants Skywalker alive. Of course, Jabba knew full well that the order for Luke's death was from Shizor, but he'd been paid well to stay silent about that and pin it on the Empire. By the time Big Giz had led the swoop gang out to the Dune Sea where Ben's hut was, Luke had finally finished constructing his new lightsaber. But even so armed, the would-be Jedi knew that he didn't have very good odds against 12 guys on swoop bikes. And though he did take out one of the goons and lead Giz and his followers a merry chase down Beggar's Canyon, Luke managed to keep his skin intact because of two things. One, the intervention of Dash Rendar, whom Leia had secretly paid to keep an eye on him, much to Luke's annoyance when he found out, and the intervention of Jix, who twice deliberately threw off Big Giz when he had Skywalker dead to rights, the second time by killing him with a rock to the skull. Meanwhile, even as Shizor spun his great scheme to have Vader humiliated, he also indulged in several pettier schemes against the Dark Lord of the Sith. For example, he informed Vader that Black Sun had knowledge of a rebel supply base somewhere out in the Outer Rim, a facility where the rebels repaired their ships. Naturally, destroying such a facility would deal a crippling blow to the Alliance. After checking the information and finding it to be true, to his frustration, Vader informed the Emperor of this. Naturally, Vader omitted the fact that he'd gotten it from Shizor. Then, the Emperor ordered him to command the mission to destroy the rebel facility personally, much to Vader's dismay, as this was something he regarded as beneath him. This was something a competent admiral could do on his own, but the Emperor's command was not to be disobeyed. Of course, Vader did his job well, destroying the rebel facility and even personally killing several pilots in his TIE Advanced. But he found the entire mission unfulfilling. None of the rebel pilots had any spark of the Force and so were too easy for him. It seemed that ever since Bespin, the only opponent that could give him any kind of challenge was his own son. And then, of course, when he reported the success, he found that Shizor was present and had informed the Emperor that the information had come from him. And so Vader had had no choice but to eat the equivalent of Space Crow and actually thank Shizor in the Emperor's presence for his intelligence. I like this bit because it shows that while Shizor is logical and very intelligent, he also is very petty when he wants to be. Of course, it's precisely because he's so intelligent and thinks out his schemes to make sure they don't blow back on him that he can get away with these kinds of petty schemes. But even Shizor can't win them all. For example, he is so impressed by the Emperor's botanical gardens that he tries to bribe the Emperor's personal gardener into his service with the promise of double pay. But the Emperor has his own intelligence network and is just as petty as Shizor, so that he finds out very quickly of the gardener's defection and makes sure that the man has an unfortunate fatal accident before he can enter Shizor's service. But then, while relaxing in his personal myostim chair, a device that basically exercises his muscles without him actually needing to work out, Shizor receives a contact from one of his guys on Rhodia. It seems that someone wants to get in touch with the head of Black Sun, and it turns out that someone is Leia, along with Lando, 3PO, and Chewie. And the moment he lays eyes on the lovely Princess of Alderaan, Shizor starts getting ideas of the distinctly unchivalrous variety. But for now, those ideas need to be put on hold in favor of more pertinent schemes, such as convincing the Emperor to allow the location of the second Death Star to fall into the hands of rebel spies. Thus, the Emperor can lure the rebels into a trap and crush them once and for all. Once again, Vader objects to the plan, but the Emperor likes the idea and his word is final. Meanwhile, Boba Fett was once more en route to delivering Han to Jabba when he ran into trouble yet again. When he'd taken out those bounty hunters that had been trying to steal the carbonite slab from him back on Gaul, one of them had been the droid 4-LOM, which Fett had disabled, but had then made the mistake of not simply jettisoning from the Slave 1. Either the droid had somehow played dead or was able to repair itself, because it then activated a signal beacon bringing Bossk and the Houndstooth down on Fett's head. Fett was able to put down 4-LOM a second time, but not before the droid bounty hunter managed to disable the unit that powered Slave 1's weapon systems, leaving Fett a sitting duck. A boarding crew led by Zuckuss took custody of Fett and Solo's carbonite slab, knowing full well that Fett didn't dare try anything. After all, if Bossk thought something wrong was going down, he could simply blow Slave 1 to smithereens, knowing that the carbonite block containing Han would certainly survive. But of course, they made the classic mistake of all enemies of Boba Fett. They were sure that they had him dead to rights once they'd confiscated his weapons. Given all the modifications he's made to it, Slave 1 itself is a weapon, and nobody knows her inner workings quite like her master. Fett easily dispatched Zuckuss's 3 helpers and held the Gand at gunpoint, forcing him to delay Bossk just long enough to set up an explosive that destroyed the link between Houndstooth and Slave 1, damaging the former and allowing the latter to make a getaway to hyperspace. Meanwhile, Luke continued to hide out on Tatooine with R2 and now with Dash Rendar when a message pod arrived, intended for Leia, delivered by a Bothan spy master named Koth Milan. Although Luke was able to access the message by claiming to be Leia's representative, the message only said that the Bothan spies had stumbled onto something important and that they needed to come to Bothawi, because this was too sensitive to be discussed in any other way but in person. Once Luke and Dash arrived at Bothawi, the intelligence proved to be quite interesting. One of Milan's agents, tipped off by someone within Black Sun, had gotten wind that the Empire was transporting a particularly important data core aboard a fertilizer transport. A data core containing information relevant to a certain project that the Empire was working on. Something big. Accompanied by Dash's Outrider and a hastily assembled group of Bothan pilots, Luke was able to intercept and disable the freighter and recover the data core, albeit at great cost. The Bothan pilots had minimal experience, and while some were killed by the freighter's defenses, many more still died from a missile that Dash Rendar tried and failed to intercept before it exploded. This actually left the normally cocky Rendar in a state of shock, unable to believe that he, the greatest flyer in the galaxy, had fouled up so badly that he'd gotten others killed. But there was little time for regrets. Luke sent Dash to Rhodia to inform Leia and Lando of recent developments, then, accompanied by Milan, went to the Bothan colony world of Kothlis, where Milan had a cryptanalysis team that could possibly slice the codes of the data core. Unfortunately, they didn't get very far before the safe house was discovered and attacked by a group of Barabal bounty hunters. Although the computer was spirited away to safety, many more Bothans, including Koth Milan, were killed, and Luke was taken prisoner, because it turns out the bounty hunters were there for him. The only reason they didn't kill him on the spot was that while the bounty for him dead was substantial, there was a second bounty for him alive that paid a lot more. Of course, Vader soon learned of Luke's capture and was content to send his agents to recover his son, but Palpatine thought the young would-be Jedi was growing too strong in the Force for that, and insisted that Vader recover young Skywalker personally. Of course, Vader didn't like that because he didn't like whatever business Shizor was scheming with the Emperor, but his master had spoken and there was nothing he could do about it. Speaking of Shizor, the leader of Black Sun, now determined to make Leia his newest conquest, decided to send Guri to retrieve her for him. Guri, programmed as she was to protect Shizor from all things, including himself, expressed reservations that perhaps her master's amorous interest might be clouding his judgment. Shizor appreciated her concerns. Guri was perhaps the only being in the galaxy that could get away with criticizing him to his face, but sent her anyway. While Leia was eager to make contact with Black Sun, she was too much the diplomat to get down to business right away. Her first meeting with Guri mostly consisted of meaningless small talk, but it was enough to give the former princess of Alderaan the impression that there was something off about this representative of Black Sun. In preparation for the second meeting with Guri, Leia, now joined by Dash along with Lando and Chewie, set up a series of advanced scanners in the hopes that it might give them some more clues about Guri. And she even had 3PO prepare a drugged cup of tea for Guri in the hopes that they might knock her out. But of course, Guri being a droid, that plan didn't go very far. The scanners were far more useful, confirming that Guri simply could not be human. For one thing, though she appeared to be a woman in her 20s, the scanners said that her skin cells couldn't be older than 10, and her body temperature was 10 degrees below the standard, too cold for a living human. Guri, weary of this diplomatic farce, decided to try and take Leia by force. But our heroes had been prepared. Lando, Dash, and Chewie had been hidden in different parts of the suite they were all staying in, and when Guri tried to make a move, they all came out guns drawn. And Guri, peerless assassin though she might be, couldn't dodge blaster bolts at such close range. Luckily, violence proved unnecessary. Guri revealed that her master did indeed know about the attempts on Luke Skywalker's life, and that he was willing to meet with Leia to discuss who might be behind it, on Coruscant. Of course, Chewbacca insisted on going with Leia. His promise to Han to keep her safe at the climax of Empire Strikes Back would permit nothing less. Meanwhile, Leia convinced a reluctant Lando to wait on Rhodia with Dash and 3PO until Luke could reconnect with them. But it turned out that Lando wasn't really willing to wait, and since Dash knew where Luke had last been, immediately headed off for Kothlis in the Falcon. En route to Coruscant aboard Guri's personal ship, the Stinger, the Wookiee and the Princess acquired disguises to get past Coruscant security. Chewie had a haircut and dyed his fur to appear as Snuka, the Wookiee bounty hunter, while Leia was given the costume of an Ubiz named Boushh, who had tried to stiff Black Sun in the past and paid for it with his life. And so after passing through Imperial customs and the seedy underbelly of Coruscant, Leia Organa at last came face to face with Prince Shizor, Underlord of the Black Sun. Meanwhile, Luke, after several days being imprisoned by the bounty hunters, was able to escape from his cell by persuading his guard to open the door for him. The old Jedi mind trick, unless you're a Hutt or a Toydarian, it never fails. Unfortunately, though his mastery of the Force was improving, Luke had not yet reached the point where he could just sneak his way out without being noticed. The bounty hunters ganged up on him, and even though he'd recovered his lightsaber, Luke was in a tight spot until Lando intervened at the last minute. Dash has gone off on errands of his own, but since he did tell Lando where Luke might be found, that was more than enough for everyone's favorite gambler to swoop in and save Luke. They managed to leave Kothlis just ahead of Darth Vader and the Executor, although during their escape, the Millennium Falcon's hyperdrive conks out, again, and they have to hide in an asteroid field for a little while until they can repair it and escape before Vader can get them. I'm not especially fond of this last bit, particularly because it seems completely pointless. But speaking of ships with problems, Boba Fett is still trying to deliver Han Solo to Tatooine aboard a badly damaged Slave One. However, the Mandalorian, ever cunning, has begun to formulate a plan that will allow him to give his enemies the slip. A plan in which the captive Zuckuss is to play a leading role. Of course, Vader, after interrogating the surviving bounty hunters, is both furious that Luke has slipped through his fingers again and is secretly impressed at his son's growing power. Although the bounty hunters don't know who put in the order to have Luke dead, they reveal under interrogation that they suspect the most likely candidate was Black Sun. At which point, Shizor's scheme finally begins to come clear for Darth Vader. After all, who else would want to see Vader disgraced more than Shizor? And how better to achieve this than by ensuring Vader's failure to capture Luke alive? This suspicion is all but confirmed when he receives a message from his agent Jix, still ensconced in Jabba the Hutt's employment, who reports the deliberately planted rumor that it's Vader himself who wants Luke dead. But these are still just rumors and accusations, not nearly enough for Vader to finally hang his hated rival once and for all. At that moment, the hated rival in question was bringing the full force of his personal charm and his potent pheromones to bear on seducing Leia Organa. And it was working. Apparently, the feline pheromone thing was Perry's idea, and originally it was intended that Leia would actually succumb to Shizor's seductions. Thankfully, that idea was scrapped. In-universe, Leia's virtue had a very large, very effective guardian. Chewie doesn't just intervene at the right moment, just as Leia is about to succumb to Shizor, but after he literally drags her out of her meeting with the Dark Prince and reveals the security camera that's been watching them this whole time, the princess realizes not only that Shizor is up to something with her personally, but that he must be the one who wants Luke dead. And so a desperate plan is hatched. Leia returned to Shizor, this time pretending to go along with his seduction, all the while buying time for Chewbacca to escape. She actually managed to string the feline along for a while, but when Shizor finally decided to put the moves on her again, Leia responded in the only appropriate way: a good hard knee to the spaceballs. Impressively, despite the obvious pain he's in, Shizor actually retains most of his poise. And I really do like this exchange between them. So, you resist me. You got that right. It was something the Wookiee said. Sometimes Wookiees are very smart, and always very loyal. Ah, here is the drawback to bright and strong women. Sometimes they are bright and strong when you least want them to be. I am pleased that you are a worthy adversary. Of course, he has Leia locked up anyway, and it turns out letting Chewbacca escape, albeit convincingly, was part of his plan all along. Seducing Leia was just a side project. So long as he has her in his custody, Shizor knows that he can rely on Luke, like a gullible fly, to wander into the spider's web of his own accord. Just as the Dark Prince had planned, Chewbacca did inform both Dash, Luke, and Lando of Leia's plight, and the Millennium Falcon managed to slip past Coruscant's orbital defenses down to the planet below. For all their effort, the plan to rescue Leia nearly died in the cradle, when Chewbacca, Lando, and Luke were cornered inside a greenhouse belonging to someone whom Lando and Leia both knew, a Hodin gardener named Sparrow. They were saved only thanks to the surprise intervention of Dash Rendar. Dash figured that helping the rebels save Leia would make amends for his failure to prevent the deaths of all those Bothans in the attack on the freighter. It was Dash who ultimately put our heroes in contact with someone that could get them into Prince Shizor's palace, an engineer with the eminently spoilerific name of Benedict Vidkin. After a good deal of haggling and a few well-placed threats, Vidkin reluctantly agreed to lead our heroes into Shizor's palace via the sewers, using his technical expertise to disable any of the traps that Shizor had left in that part of the system. Of course, as you might have guessed from the man's name, Vidkin tried to backstab our heroes by shooting them the moment they'd reached their destination. But the treacherous lowlife should have stuck to engineering, as he only managed to wing Dash before the smuggler put a blaster bolt right between the eyes. Meanwhile, at the tippy top of his palace, Shizor was starting to get the feeling that something bad was going to happen. He couldn't explain where this bad feeling was coming from, but he hadn't gotten to where he was by ignoring his instincts. And so, even as he tended to day-to-day business, making deals, handing out bribes, and occasionally enjoying the luxuries his stupefying wealth could buy, he instructed Guri to put his security forces on high alert. It seemed the Dark Prince's nebulous concerns might have been justified. Even as he left Coruscant to personally oversee the construction of the Death Star 2, Palpatine made a brief comlink call on Shizor, informing him that he was aware of the Feline's interest in Luke Skywalker. Shizor, of course, denied this, and certainly there was no evidence linking him to the attempts on Luke's life. No conclusive evidence anyway, but it was clear that the Emperor was suspicious. If Shizor's plan was to work, he would have to tread especially carefully. Of course, none of this meant that he was going to stop his usual business, or that it would curtail his efforts to seduce Leia, which thus far had proven unsuccessful. Guri once again expressed her disapproval of Shizor continuing down this particular road, and Perry gives them this exchange that's so good that I have to quote it verbatim. "Your pheromonal attractant was insufficient to bend her to your will. That has never happened before. I had noticed that, thank you. This failure has made her more appealing. Your point? One wants more what one cannot have. As long as she resists your advances, her charisma grows stronger. The more she resists, the more you desire her. It has become a contest of wills. So it has, which I will win, eventually. You doubt me? You have never failed before. And you, my ever-vigilant bodyguard, you do not approve. The more intelligent and dedicated someone is, the more dangerous she can be when threatened. You of all beings should understand. Much of life is about the search for equals. You are unique. There are others similar to you, but none exactly like you. You are superior to any other HRD ever created. Yes. Don't you ever want to meet one who is capable of moving, of feeling, of thinking up to your level? An equal? Not particularly. What would be the point? Greater than I, lesser than I. What does it matter to my functioning? Yet you wish for tasks that will challenge you. Of course, it is the same thing. Yes, it is dangerous to contend with one who might defeat you, and perhaps it is even more dangerous to consort with one who might someday stab you as you lie sleeping next to her. Still, the possibilities are so much more. There are billions of women, many of whom are more beautiful, more adept physically, even more dedicated, maybe even all three. But this one is the one I want, and I will have her. Ah, this is why you eat moonglow. Side note, moonglow fruit is basically the pufferfish of the Star Wars universe. It is incredibly rare, ludicrously expensive, and entirely lethal unless prepared an exact way by a highly trained and qualified chef. Meanwhile, Darth Vader, left in charge of Coruscant while the Emperor was away, had been busy in his own right. Alas, his agents had not uncovered the kind of conclusive evidence that would finally allow him to nail Shizor to the proverbial wall, but they had uncovered something that was almost as good. Despite Shizor's best efforts to erase it all those years ago, Vader's agents had succeeded in unearthing the connection between the head of Black Sun and the Feline noble family that had died when Vader had destroyed their city to contain the bioplague outbreak. At last, Vader understood Shizor's motives, not just for wanting to kill Luke Skywalker and thus humiliate Vader, but also the Feline's rivalry with him in general. It wasn't just competing for the Emperor's favor, it was personal. Overall, Vader was actually feeling pretty good about things, a very rare circumstance for him. Though he lacked his master's ability to see into the future, Vader had the sense that Shizor might be in danger of entangling himself in his own web of schemes. The Underlord of Black Sun had already spun himself plenty of rope. It was just a question of whether or not events might induce Shizor to place his neck in the noose of his own making. The plan was for Luke, Lando, Dash, and Chewie to infiltrate the palace stealthily to free Leia, but after they'd been slogging through the sewers for so long, they found a guard room. They tried to take them by surprise, but Chewbacca slipped on the floor. They took the guards out, but they were able to get off the alarm. So they ended up having to shoot and saber their way up to reach Leia. They did try to conceal their presence by destroying the power breakers on every level, thus depriving surveillance systems of the ability to watch them, but Shizor was smarter than that, and the pattern of each successive level going dark allowed him to predict where they were going and get ahead of them with Guri and a posse of guards. He actually managed to get the drop on Luke, and if it hadn't been for his force-driven reflexes, young Skywalker would have died with a blaster bolt through his skull. Cornered and outnumbered, the rebels resorted to desperate measures. A thermal detonator on a dead man's switch. one of 3 A-class high explosives, capable of leveling Shizor's palace. Shizor was left with no choice but to let them go. He could always try and get back at them later, but only if he remained alive. But, just to make sure that he couldn't try anything, Lando took the second thermal detonator, activated it with a 5-minute countdown, and threw it down the garbage chute. Now there was no room in anyone's mind but escape. Guri managed to waylay them right before they reached the landing pad where the Millennium Falcon was coming in. Oh, by the way, C-3PO actually had to fly the Falcon for a while with R2's help. I would actually pay money to see that because it sounds funny as hell. Anyway, once again, Luke's growing strength in the Force allowed him to prevail over Guri, but though she was willing to accept her demise, Luke decided to show mercy to the human replica droid, allowing her a chance to escape on her own. Even as the Millennium Falcon took off and Shizor's palace exploded and collapsed in on itself, the Dark Prince made his way to his second home on Coruscant. A skyhook, essentially a low-orbit platform anchored to the planet's surface, called the Phalene's Fist. Shizor had always prided himself as a being of rationality and control, but the loss of his palace, which meant the loss of countless priceless artifacts as well as equally priceless data stores of criminal intelligence, the leader of Black Sun briefly allowed his anger to rule him. He did have a sizable navy presence of his own on Coruscant. He was, after all, officially a shipping magnate, and it happened that most of his ships were heavily armed for protection, and he now ordered them to target the Millennium Falcon and destroy it. In the act of doing so, he slipped up and actually mentioned Luke Skywalker by name, and this communique was picked up by agents loyal to Vader. At last, the Sith Lord had his smoking gun. Meanwhile, although Dash was able to spacewalk to the Outrider, it, along with the Millennium Falcon, was heavily outnumbered by the Black Sun ships that were now targeting them. Even a sudden intervention by Rogue Squadron, whom Chewbacca had also asked for help in rescuing Leia, could not save them. But then, the Imperial Navy presence around Coruscant showed up and began shooting the Black Sun ships. Vader contacted the Phalene's Fist and delivered an ultimatum. Either Shizor stopped trying to destroy the Falcon, or Vader would open fire on the Phalene's Fist and risk the Emperor's displeasure later. Shizor had 2 minutes to comply. Exposed, cornered, and caught between conflicting desires for vengeance, Shizor, for the first time in his life, was paralyzed with indecision. It proved to be his last. The 2 minutes elapsed with no response. Vader gave the order, the Executor opened fire, and the Phalene's Fist went up like a fireworks display. Our heroes made good their escape in the confusion, but the triumph was marred with tragedy, as it looked like the Outrider collided with a piece of wreckage during the escape, and it seemed that Dash Rendar was no more. His passing was mourned, but now that there was no longer an attempt on Luke's life, our heroes could dedicate themselves to what they were trying to do this whole time: get Han Solo back. By now, the former smuggler had indeed arrived on Tatooine courtesy of Boba Fett. Naturally, his rivals, including Bosk, had been awaiting him, preparing to ambush Slave One, and they took Fett and his prize captive, only to discover that it wasn't Fett, but Zuckuss disguised in the Mandalorian armor. And it wasn't Solo's slab, but the remains of Forlom. After much frustration and so many twists and turns, Boba Fett had finally delivered his prize and claimed, from a grudging Jabba, the 10,000 credit bounty. At least our heroes now knew where Han was going to be for a while. Meanwhile, Palpatine had returned to Coruscant and was brought up to speed on recent events. He revealed to Vader that he'd always known of Shizor's duplicity, but had not done anything because the Dark Prince had been useful to him. But the Emperor had been just as invested in turning Luke to the dark side as Vader was, and the moment Shizor had outed himself by ordering Skywalker's destruction, he had condemned himself. So, as it turned out, Vader suffered no punishment for finally squashing his hated rival. And so Shadows of the Empire concludes, with Vader being sent to the Death Star 2 to ensure that it will be operational on schedule, while Luke, back on Tatooine, records a message for Jabba the Hutt, thus setting in motion the events of Return of the Jedi. And here we'll end for now. But it won't be long because, as I'm sure you know, the story of Shadows of the Empire is not yet complete. Both the book and the comic cover the principal events of the story from multiple perspectives, with the comic throwing in the Boba Fett subplot. But there is a third part to Shadows, one deserving of its own video. Shadows of the Empire, the video game. Until then. It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at StudioBrainstorm.net. Links in the description.